So I'm glad that you've joined us today. I'm looking forward to sharing with you some things that I've been studying and learning this week that have been an encouragement to my own heart. What an amazing few weeks this has been. Life has changed so dramatically, moving in unexpected places with unprecedented adjustments for everyone. I've spent stretches of time thinking and praying for so many people. Those of you with elderly parents who are in senior care facilities and they can't understand why they're in virtual lockdown right now. Those of you whose workplaces have been rattled by the economic tremors without any clear sign of when or even if things are going to recover. Those who are beginning to hear of people you know that have contracted the virus. If you haven't heard yet, you will. The first one we've heard of is a pastor that I knew out in Burkina Faso. I've prayed for children transitioning to schooling at times and their teachers, and the sadness especially for those seniors who are supposed to be graduating from high school and this school year is ending much differently than they had been dreaming about. And then thinking about those with retirement accounts that are a fraction of what they were worth just a month ago. And the questions come to mind. Why doesn't God stop this? Doesn't He care? Can He help us rebound? And of course, the most important question, did I buy enough toilet paper? We need to laugh. Here is the funniest thing that I saw this week. So could the Bible actually have anything relevant to say to us in times that everyone is calling unprecedented? The sermon series I've decided to focus on in the weeks to come is influenced by teaching by Timothy Keller and an author named James Bruckner. I've chosen to call this series Living with Faith in Uncertain Times. And for it, we're going to be studying the book of, wait for it, Habakkuk. Yes, you heard me right. Some of you don't even know there's a book called Habakkuk in the Bible. It's in the Old Testament. In my Bible, it's on page 959. It's right after Nahum and right before Zephaniah. Two other guys that you may not have heard of very much. He's an obscure Old Testament prophet who we know almost nothing about. Even the scholars don't know much about him. He lived 600 years before Jesus, around the time when the southern kingdom of Judah was taken into exile by the Babylonians. And we're going to look at three main aspects from the first chapter today. The first thing that we're going to consider is this. What did Habakkuk observe? So King David lived and ruled about 300 years before Habakkuk, and the king during Habakkuk's lifetime was King Jehoiakim. He was, I think, the 17th great-great-great-great-grandson of King David, many centuries after David was long gone. Now, Jehoiakim's dad, Josiah, was a well-known king, one of the most godly kings that Israel had, and spiritually, the nation was crescendoing upwards throughout his reign. Josiah was one of the best kings Israel ever had, and he left the kingdom in good shape. Josiah would have given everyone the hope that good times were going to continue as they had been going for a few decades. I think his campaign theme was probably something along the lines of "Make Israel Great Again," and he delivered on that. But under his son Jehoiakim, Egypt bulldozed over Israel. They made Jehoiakim a puppet king, and the kingdom and the prosperity and the good times under Josiah were unraveling before their eyes. That sounds familiar. And that's when Habakkuk speaks to God in chapter 1, verse 1. This is what it says. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. The words for destruction and violence in verse 3 refer to the havoc that is wreaked on the infrastructure and on the relationships in communities. Again, how relevant could that be? It was a society where now little was functioning well. Crime and violence, corruption, and a total collapse of the legal system led to good people suffering in horrific ways. The nation was in ruins. It's like it could be written in 2020. That's what Habakkuk could see taking place. And in several different historical periods in the Bible, the same sentiments are expressed by different biblical characters. So let me remind you of something that you probably have known, but perhaps might have forgotten in recent weeks, and that is this. Bad times have persisted throughout all of history. Bad times are not unique to our time. Whether they are due to ungodly leadership at upper levels, or to wars from enemy nations, or natural catastrophes, history shows that virtually every generation has lived through really tough times, and they survive. In one way or another, we will too. Here's a great lesson for us to remember. Just like the ease of life a month ago has not lasted and negative changes have happened, I believe the hardship of life right now will not last forever either. Habakkuk's mistake is that he's coming to conclusions based on a very short window of time. And we can't afford to do the same. It's not the path of wisdom. Yes, we certainly may be just at the very beginning of a long stretch of bad times. No one knows if this will last months, maybe years. But if we take the time to understand this book of Habakkuk, we won't be surprised or nearly as devastated by them as we would be without an understanding of the book. In fact, if we had understood the principles of Habakkuk more deeply before now, I think we would have been far more prepared for the events of these past 3 weeks. So that's what Habakkuk observed, that everything was going negative. There was a total collapse in society, a total decline. The second thing I'd like us to see is, how did Habakkuk respond? And I see two qualities in his complaint to God, both in these verses as well as in other places, where he says to God, God, why do you tolerate this? Why aren't you listening? Why won't you save us? We're your chosen people after all. The two qualities that I see in his response are he's bold and he is honest. On the one hand, Habakkuk rejects what I sensed in my very conservative church upbringing as a kid, that responding to God with frustrations about life was off limits, that Christians should shut their mouths and never tell God that they're disappointed in how things are going in life. That approach certainly isn't bold, but it's also not honest. The book of Job is filled with Job's frustrations over the circumstances God allowed him to be going through. Lamentations is an entire book dedicated to airing out Jeremiah's grievances. And about 1/3 of the Psalms are filled with complaint after complaint after complaint about God's actions or God's inaction. I want to remind you again of one of my favorite quotes that I've shared several times before, and I'll probably do it in the future. It's from Matt Chandler, who says, God knows it's scary to be us, which is why I believe he includes so many examples of godly people in the Bible who complained. So Habakkuk rejects this artificial response of, hey, God, this is all fine with me. I don't think any of us are feeling much of that these days. But on the other hand, he rejects the response of giving up on God and walking away. Habakkuk does neither one of those things. He complains, but he does so in prayer. He gripes, but at the same time, he leans in on God while he's doing it. This is what it says in verse 12. After God's first response to his initial complaint, Habakkuk speaks again and he says, O God, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, will not die. His question is like a rhetorical question. It's almost on the verge of mocking God, almost reminding God, hey, you are, after all, the everlasting one, as if maybe God has forgotten and realized that he hadn't realized that he had powers to change things, or it's maybe as if he thinks God has changed. But then he tempers it by calling God my Holy One, literally, my not evil-doing God, my not wrong-doing God. So Habakkuk never hints that he might be walking away from God. Timothy Keller says it's like he's telling God, if I can't figure out life with you, how in the world will I be able to figure out life without you? Let me suggest to you that this type of person who honestly leans in on God with bold frustration is a rare type of person, but an incredibly resilient one, because it takes gospel grace to produce that kind of a person. We know life is hard, and when we admit that our sin has made it that way. So we get to this point in our faith walk where we ask forgiveness for our sin, and remarkably then we're granted forgiveness for that sin. And then we face tough times again, and we remember, God, this is really hard, but you freed me from my worst problem, so where else would I go but to you? James Bruckner in his book writes this: lamentations and questionings are actually God's gift to the believer. They provide a pathway of honest faith and faithful conversation with Him in horrible times. Habakkuk is free to make these statements because he knows God will let him speak, that God's love for him is unconditional, that God won't kick him away from him just because he's frustrated with what God is allowing. And then the third point that I want us to see from this chapter is this: what did Habakkuk hear from God? Remember, Israel is in free fall. This society is crumbling around him. And this is the beginning of God's response in verse 5. He says, "Look at the nations and watch. Be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told." And at this point in time, if Habakkuk had just a split second to think, here's what I believe that he would be thinking, he would be anticipating: there is great news that's coming. God is going to deal with our evil King Jehoiakim, and he's maybe going to deal with Egypt as well. But the next words from God stopped him in his tracks. Because verse 6 says this, God speaking, "I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people." And then he proceeds to describe how Babylon treats those that they conquer, and that Israel is in the path of Babylon. Here's what God is saying. And you might not find this real encouraging. God is telling Habakkuk, you haven't seen anything yet. Things are going to get worse. They're going to get much worse. And it's going to come at the hands of the worst thugs in the neighborhood. Like if you're a Democrat right now, God is saying, Republicans are going to be in control of the House, the Senate, and President Trump is going to be reelected. And if you're a Republican, it's as if God is saying, Bernie Sanders is going to be president in the fall. Here's a quote that I heard for the first time this week that saturated my heart with peace. God is always in control. Yeah, it's not the first time I heard that. There's more to it. You've heard that before. But this is what struck me. God is always in control of who is in control. Babylon was absolutely ruthless as a conquering empire. Habakkuk knew that. But what Habakkuk couldn't know, and what God didn't fully tell him, was that God was setting in motion like a string of dominoes that were ultimately part of his greater plan, and that greater plan would eventually lead to the coming of Jesus Christ. And through all the dominoes that would fall, God was always in control of who was in control. So let me share a little bit about the dominoes that would be taking place in the next 600 years. It would last a long time for them. 15 years after Habakkuk's prophecy, approximately, is when Babylon invaded. They totally conquered the region. They took massive numbers of Jews into exile, where actually they were able to live peacefully. And later, when they were permitted to leave Babylon, history tells us that many of them eventually dispersed throughout the Middle East and around the Mediterranean Sea. And so most major cities ended up having a Jewish quarter to it, where the Jews lived, where they started businesses, where they built synagogues, and they made friends with the people around them. Those relationships oftentimes led to non-Jews, to Gentiles, being drawn to their Jewish God. And the domination of the Babylonians eventually gave way to the Persian Empire, which eventually gave way to the Greek Empire. And the Greek Empire was known for uniting a huge geographical region, united it educationally and linguistically under the Greek language, the language of the New Testament. The next domino was the Roman Empire, whose contribution was connecting their empire with an amazing network of roads. You've heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome, allowing for much greater transportation and trade. And then Jesus Christ came along. And after Jesus Christ died, and the number of Jewish followers of Jesus grew, they traveled to cities throughout the region. They could communicate with the same language because the Greek Empire existed. They landed in cities where there were already Jews that were established who had already connected with Gentiles. They were able to travel on the roads that the Romans had provided. And because Jews were a known entity by many Gentiles who were drawn toward the Jewish faith in various numbers, the most receptive audience to the news about Jesus Christ ended up being those God-fearing Gentiles in towns all around the Mediterranean. You see, Habakkuk was crying out to God for deliverance from the violence and corruption of the 7th century Israelite king. He saw the micro picture. God was setting the table for the Messiah to arrive and for the news about him to travel all throughout the world for 20 plus centuries. God's concern wasn't the micro picture, God's concern was the mega picture. And we're the ones who benefited from that. So God says to Habakkuk, I'm actually going to bring more injustice and allow even more violence. And that's exactly how I'm going to work out the salvation of all mankind. Babylon was horrifically evil. In fact, all of those empires were evil with their torture and their child sacrifice and sex slavery and perverted idolatry. But history has shown that the teachings and the example of Jesus Christ, as they filtered into culture after culture all throughout the world for the last 2,000 years, has influenced culture on a grand scale that has been markedly less violent, with less child sacrifice, less torture, less sexual slavery than those evil kingdoms. Now, I know Christianity has not been perfect. I'm not saying that. But the influence of Jesus' teachings and of those who adhere closely to him has been a positive thing on cultures for 2,000 plus years. Here's the lesson. Don't judge God by your timetable, by your calendar, and the view from your rooftop. Does not the greater picture of God's goodness redeem the shorter-term pain that Israel experienced when Habakkuk was writing? Habakkuk couldn't have seen that, but we can. I might have shared before that near the end of the Vietnam War, Alliance missionaries in the early 1970s needed to flee from that country, and they left behind an Alliance church network of churches that was fairly weak and somewhat immature. There were thousands of believers, but nothing of great influence in a country that numbered in the tens of millions. Then the Iron Curtain of communism came down in that country, and the condition of the Christian church was unknown for decades. More than 25 years later, Alliance leaders from America were finally invited to visit, and they wondered how the church had fared during their absence, thinking that without strong missionary leadership, the church had probably really struggled and crumbled. But when they got there, they were overwhelmed to discover that the Alliance had more than 1 million believers alone, not to mention any of the other evangelical churches in the country that also had stretches where they thrived. It was something that none of the leaders back in the early 1970s, Vietnamese church leaders or Alliance missionaries, could ever have anticipated. And whereas those Vietnamese believers certainly felt abandoned by God and abandoned by the missionaries, it was the persecution of the church that was the exact tool God used to raise up a mighty church. So I ask these questions. Would America be better served by a powerful economy or by a powerful church? Are God's hands tied from working because society has increasingly shut down? Tomorrow we're going to be starting our River Rock prayer trek. And we had initially intended it to be something that would bring us to the end of the capital campaign, where our hope was that the finances for our future church home would be clear. But obviously that's changed. But God hasn't changed. Listen to all of verse 12. That was the verse where Habakkuk responds to God's response. O Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, we will not die. O Lord, you have appointed them, the Babylonians, to execute judgment. O Rock, you have ordained them to punish. God is our rock. It's not the economy. It's not our healthcare system. This isn't referring, when it says rock, it's not referring to a small rock that we might skip across a lake. It often in Scripture refers to a cliff, to massive boulders, to slabs of rock on the ground that could form the foundation for something to be built on, a large building or a house. Something that doesn't move. The rock refers to something that doesn't change. Again, Habakkuk reminds himself, God is my rock. So his plan, his path, isn't the thing that changes. It's us. It's we who must conform to what he is doing. The principle here in Habakkuk is that God eventually brings light out of some of the worst darkness. He brings salvation and redemption out of injustice and wrongdoing, out of evil and suffering. But the God of the Bible doesn't say, believe that and struggle through it on your own. I'm not going to subject myself to that principle. You see, that principle finds its ultimate expression in the cross of Jesus Christ. Facing the horror of his torture and the cross, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus chooses the response of Habakkuk. Things were going downhill, but it was going to be getting worse in the next 24 hours for Jesus. He's honest with God, his Father, but he's also bold. He doesn't say, hey, Father, this is all great. That would be like the superficial sham that isn't honest with how his feelings, his emotions, his concern about the pain that he would be going through was going to be like, not to mention the rejection of the Father. But he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He wrestles with God's will, but ultimately he says, thy will be done. That truth, his example, is our greatest reason for hope. If we were plunging into a long, bad time of darkness and uncertainty without an example of God allowing his people to suffer while he works out an even better and greater plan, well then, I'd probably be despairing like Wall Street stockbrokers must be despairing these days. But let's remember the history of God's people. Let's remember the story of God's Son. Let's remember the example of Habakkuk. Yes, things got much worse, but only so that it could eventually become much greater. And that promise is not that your 401k is going to miraculously rebound and 6 months down the road or 2 years down the road be much greater than it is right now, and that's the good that God wants to bring out of this. That might happen. It might not. It's not promised. That promise is not that your job is soon going to come with a greater salary or that you find a different job with a better salary. Don't misunderstand me. The promise is that life may get worse on one front, but if we lean into God and his greater purposes, he will sustain us. And he will bless us in ways that far surpass the pain of what we may have to go through. So go ahead and wrestle with them. I've told him a few things about where my heart is at these last few weeks. It's okay to be honest and transparent, but don't walk away. This is not permanent. This is not the last word. This is not the end of the story. For I believe that down the road, we'll be able to look back and we'll be able to see what he was doing behind the scenes this very moment. Let's bow for prayer. God, what I love about your word is that there are stories that took place sometimes 2,000, 3,000 years ago and even longer than that are just extremely relevant to where my heart is at these days. I can resonate with Habakkuk saying, God, why aren't you going to stop this? And that's a short-sighted response. It's a lack of ultimate faith in you, God, that if we do lean in on you, we will come to the understanding, whether sooner or later, that there is a bigger picture throughout all of this. And we believe that you may have some of the most amazing things that you want to do in our lifetime, spiritually, in our individual lives, in the life of our church, in our state, in this country, that perhaps we might look back at someday and say, wow, was God ever at work when it seemed like he had totally checked out? I pray for my brothers and sisters in Christ these days. You know the anxiety, the angst that they feel in their hearts. I pray that as they come to you with their honest feelings about how they're struggling, how they're afraid, how they're discouraged, how they're aggravated, I pray that you would hear their prayers, and I pray that you would remind them of the truth, that you are by our side, that you're working out your plan, and that you ultimately are in control, always, of who is in control. In Jesus Christ's name, I pray this prayer. Amen. God bless you. Have a great week.